Mearsheimer's view is that it's happening again with China, which, in a sense, I believe that China is a different kettle of fish, and that it's not playing that game. It tries not to play that game, and is seeking to enable other sovereign nations in a way. Although, in the end, this is a game of power. Still, I've got some hope that China is doing it differently. That's a separate issue to Russia. We could talk about them in a different way. Added to which, of course, the West represents 1/10 of the population of the world, and the rest of the world is rising, and I am hoping that the rest of the world will gather round China as their economic support system. But that will, of course, threaten the West, and it will, and that will continue to create conflict. I can't see a way of the world carrying on without that conflict. That in a sense, unless it's for the most powerful nation to walk away from war, if you like, and I can't see a way for either side to walk away from armed conflict. But where are we with this?
Well, I think you're absolutely right that the rise of China is the key factor in the world today, and that whether it's war or peace, will depend on how that is handled both by the Chinese and by the rest of the
West.
I think you mentioned China's relations with the rest of the world, which is I think is the thing that most worries the United States. I think they're much more worried about that than they are about a direct threat from China, because what China is doing is establishing a new sort of relationship between one powerful power and a lot of poorer, less developed, but in some cases rapidly developing nations. The United States and its supporters, and when I say the United States, I'm referring, of course, to the ruling class,
the collective West,
the ruling class, not to the American people, who mostly don't know what's going on anyway. The slogan, if you like, is a rule-based system. A rule-based system. The Economist uses that phrase at least once in every issue. And of course what they mean is a system on which we fix the rules. And the rules mainly are the sort of what they're talking about. They're not talking about international law, because they've been breaking international law quite,
with impunity.
Yeah, with impunity. What they're talking about is the sort of rules which the International Monetary Fund impose on countries when they make loans to it. Rules like you must privatize this and that and the other. You must reduce the size of the state and government expenditure. These are rules. Now, when China makes loans or grants to other countries, it does not impose such conditions. I know there are various tensions between China and some of the countries that receive help from it, and this is inevitable for a whole lot of reasons. But they do not attempt to interfere in the domestic policies of those countries, which is precisely what the United States and agencies which it controls. I mean, let's face it, the World Bank, the IMF and the World Trade Organization are in effect agencies of American imperialism, because they put in most of the money and they have most of the vote. But China is trying to establish a totally different relationship, and I think with some success. And I think this is probably what scares the Americans more than anything. Now, one can only guess what the American strategy for containing China is, but it may well be that it's similar to what they did with the Soviet Union. That is to build up armaments, forcing the other side also to arm in self-defense, and hope that this will bring down the economy.
I feel that the American approach is certainly to keep its military ahead of everybody, and plainly that I think you can say that bankrupted the Soviet Union.
I think it was, yes.
It was part of the reason.
I think it was one of the big factors in the collapse of the Soviet Union. Indeed, it was. They overstretched themselves, and I think Reagan was quite clear that's what he was doing. And I think they may well be trying to do the same thing with China, which is very, very sad. I mean, I'm sure the Chinese don't want to spend the amounts they are spending on armaments.
Doing well not doing so until fairly recently. Yeah.
I mean, they've just increased their military expenditure by 7%. But I'm sure they don't want to do that. They would much rather be using that money to solve some of their problems of growth. And they've got big problems to face. One is their aging population, which is a very big challenge. And another is how they're going to eventually get rid of the capitalism that they've deliberately fostered. I think if you read between the lines of some of the things that President Xi Jinping says, he is very concerned about this. He's certainly trying to, he's been dealing with the corruption, which was one of the results of having so much capitalism. Capitalism fosters corruption. And the question of inequality, which is inequality between different groups of people, which is very great in China. They've got enormous challenges. And
they have succeeded in feeding everybody and housing everybody, which is absolutely enormous. Nobody's ever, this is simply a threat instead of being seen as an enormous achievement.
Yes, absolutely. Okay. What can we do about it? That's what's worrying you.
I'd be pleased to think that the Chinese model is seen for what it is. At the moment, the West is there's one tune coming from particularly the very sophisticated Western media, which is that they are, standing up to tyrants, if you like. That's the first thing I get told, that Xi Jinping and Putin are tarred with the same brush, and that they are both tyrants, and that this is the reason that all this is going on. So I see China as a glimmer of hope, if you like. I think that the Chinese model is looking good. They have to play the game, the great power game. They've got to protect their borders, and there is an issue about their influence in the Asian region. But my problem is that I can't see a way of negotiating this with the West in any sort of a peaceful way. And if you like, I would love to see some Western politicians who saw their interests as negotiating with the Chinese. In my dreams, Australia, for instance, has more reason to be an ally of China than America. But if it swapped sides, the Americans would, soon train their guns on the Australians. As an example, I'd like to see a cooperation between India and China. I see India as a rising great power. But the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and BRICS are now bigger economically than its Western equivalents.
Yep.
So we have a force meeting a force with equal strength. And however much the West or the American capitalist class or the blob or whoever they are want to rule the world for whatever, they are not going to be able to. They've hit a rock. And you think, well, okay, if that's what will then happen when you have essentially a rising power meeting a waning power? And in the past, it's mainly led to war. No matter how far back you go, okay, we're talking about pre-capitalism, it's led to war. There is a need for a different way of looking at things, but what we've got in the West is a very, very sophisticated propaganda machine that doesn't allow people to see through the smoke and the mirrors. And we are all convinced that things are that the West is standing up for freedom, and whatever the excuses are for, the West was busy imposing at the end of the barrel of a gun freedom on sovereign states that weren't in its gang, and this has led over and over to misery and destruction, but it doesn't need to concern them, or at least doesn't need to concern America. It doesn't have to deal with the consequences, but Europe, for instance, does. So I was hoping for the odd enlightened European party or politician to stand up to the USA. It's not happened so far. You occasionally get signs that maybe Europe will change its tune. It's not in Europe's interest necessarily to do America's bidding on this one. It's not in Australia and New Zealand's interest. But it's they are given the choice. They're either on the bus or you're either my friend or my enemy. There's no chance of having a non-aligned position, or at least that seems to be the way it's going. It's clarifying itself more into two worlds.
Well, I think you're right that the change is not going to come in Europe or in Australia. But you mentioned BRICS. Now that is where perhaps the change may come. And not just BRICS, but from the developing world generally. Because, well, for instance, the South Africa and a number of other African countries are trying to mediate in the war in Ukraine. Now that, I think, that nothing may come of this at the moment, or it may. China, of course, is doing the same thing.
Surprisingly, China is succeeding diplomatically around the world, which is...
Yeah, and hopefully it will succeed diplomatically on the Ukraine. I don't know what the chances are, but at least China is trying, and this is where new approaches are likely to come from, in my view, not from Europe.